Thanks, Casey. Yeah, and it's great to be here. I was on the other side of the room many years ago now at this point, but it's cool to be here and sharing some of where price theory led me over the course of my PhD. So hopefully in that sense it can be inspiring to all of you in some way. But I want to start really with a simple equation from the industry model, which I think you guys covered relatively recently. And that equation was just that the change in price is equal to the share in capital times the change in the rental rate of capital plus the share in labor times the change in the wage. Is this a good place for me to write, Casey?
Yeah, do we have any better light for that?
There's usually a light there.
Oh, perfect.
That's better, right?
Yes, and everyone can see in the back? Okay. So this was an equation we didn't really think necessarily about there being different industries in this model. We were thinking about, okay, this is some industry that's producing using capital and labor. It has a price, and under the assumptions that went into the industry model, we were able to derive that the change in the price was this share weighted average of the change in the rental rate and the change in the wage. So what I want to think about now in the spirit of just relabeling variables is, let's broaden our scope from thinking about just, say, capital and labor to other inputs that an industry might buy. And so we're about to make this equation a lot longer and a lot more complicated. And then that's going to expose a weakness of it. So what do I want to do now is now I want to take, I guess we just lost that light, but maybe that's just this side. I'll use these two boards then. So now we're going to extend this equation, and we're going to extend it by saying each industry buys a bunch of different what we'll call common factors. So that could be something like labor, it could be natural resources. And to keep things simple, I'll say there's just two common factors that we'll consider. And then there's a bunch of intermediate inputs it might buy. So we're considering an industry like a plastics manufacturer, and they're buying petrochemicals, they're buying other organic chemicals, they're buying things like that in addition to using labor inputs and perhaps using the other common factors, natural resources themselves and the like. And so how we'll do that now, and I guess just to make things very clear is I'll set up the cost minimization problem again so we know exactly what's happening. So now we'll have a cost function in a sector I that's going to be a function of the input prices of the factors, which I'm going to call W1 and W2, following the notation that you guys usually use that factor prices are W. And now I'm going to have a whole vector really of intermediate input prices. So P1 is going to be the price of an input that you buy from industry 1, but you might buy inputs from industries all the way up to industry capital I. And then the cost function, as usual, will also depend on the level of output produced in industry I. And this is going to be defined as, so we're still going to say that this industry produces this output in the way that minimizes the cost of producing it. So exactly the same cost minimization problem that you've seen before, and really exactly the same problem as the expenditure minimization problem that you saw much earlier in the course. And so you'll minimize W1, and now the notation here will be XI1, that's how much industry I is buying input 1. Same for common factor XI2. So again, we're thinking about one of these, let's say, as labor, and one of these maybe as natural resources. And now there's all of the inputs that you buy from every other sector. So this will be J equals 1 to capital I of Pj x, or let's use now the notation Zij. So Zij will be how much sector I is buying an intermediate input from sector J. So I think there's a lot of disagreement on the notation in the literature for intermediate inputs. Some people like to draw an arrow here and say, just to make it ultra clear, that it's input J being supplied to industry I. But let's just keep track of it for today. Okay, and then this is all subject to, and this will be why the cost function is actually industry specific, production equaling this level of output. So you'll produce using those original raw factors, let's call them, and also all of the intermediate inputs. So is this setup clear to everybody?
I guess could you just clarify the difference between a raw factor and an intermediate one? Is that the intermediate someone else has produced it?
So the idea is there's a bunch of industries in the economy and they're producing these. So in particular, this industry that we're looking at, industry I, is producing one of those intermediate inputs. And we'll clarify how exactly that works when I tell you about the mapping from where we're going to go with this to the BEA's input-output data and why it appears that industries buy inputs from themselves and what exactly that means. But these common factors are going to be things that we typically think about as not being produced. So that's like oil in the ground, natural resources in the ground, labor. There's a sense in which labor is produced with human capital that you guys will discuss, but we're going to consider a very simple notion of labor right now. Any other questions on the setup?